In the past 24 hours, he's been in and out of hospital, treated for a suspicious allergic reaction. Since returning to prison last night, he wrote on his blog saying, "I've never had allergies, not to food, not to pollen or anything else." He went on to say, "At night, I woke up with a hot and prickly face, ears and neck. I felt like I'd had my face rubbed with glass wool." He went on to say, "I had the thought maybe I've been poisoned. What did the doctors say in the end?" They said in the history of medicine, there are cases when a person suddenly develops an allergy. What do I think about this? Or even, to put it bluntly, do I think that they could poison me?
So let's look at this further by bringing in the prominent Russian investigative journalist Andrei Soldatov. He's due in Australia for the Antidote Festival next month, but tonight he joins us from Moscow. Welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you.
As we just heard, the UN is weighing in, calling for the freedom to protest in Russia. How meaningful is that in the current circumstances?
I think it's still meaningful because, we have a lot of people, a lot of Muscovites who want to protest that we were deprived of the right to elect their representatives, and it's a big thing for the Russian political life. We have the protest back to Russian life from the time of 2011, 2012, and it's a new development and clearly very promising.
Alexei Navalny's spokeswoman, Kiriya Yarmysh, has confirmed that he's been discharged from hospital. That's against his doctor's wishes, and sent back to jail. How much danger is he in right now if he is indeed back in his jail cell?
Well, unfortunately, in Russian political life, poison is a very substantial factor. We have prominent journalists, we have prominent opposition politicians poisoned before, and unfortunately, we need to take this into consideration when we think about the opponents of the Kremlin, and that's why we need a real investigation what actually happened to Alexei Navalny in jail. And obviously, lots of people are worried now in Moscow.
What are the prospects of that actually happening in Russia, a proper investigation taking place, despite the fact that, people know what's taken place? Maybe the prospects are pretty grim, but we have some, as far as I know, some test samples of his skin and some of his bio details were sent to Israel for some testing. So we hope that some investigation, some information about what actually happened, we can get that information finally. How high up does this go? Does it go all the way to Vladimir Putin? We can only speculate right now, but unfortunately, given the history, the recent history, what happened in Russia when former deputy of prime minister was killed right in front of the Kremlin in 2015, when his deputy, Vladimir Kara-Murza, was poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017. And given the climate in Russia that everybody knows that Putin likes to micromanage things, especially things sensitive for his standing in power, it's difficult to rule out all these opportunities. It's quite an indelicate way to deal with a political opponent, given how high-profile Alexei Navalny is. Is the lack of subtlety in this deliberate?
Well, unfortunately, the thing is that we sometimes think that it's so brutal. Sometimes we've seen some clear failures, for instance, in Salisbury in the UK. But nevertheless, it sends a very strong message to the Russian opposition, to activists, to journalists. And given the fact that we live in a country with a very difficult history, with a history of poisonings, with the history of very brutal actions taken against the Kremlin opponents, to be honest, it's quite effective. People think twice about taking part in any political activity, and you need to be really brave to go to streets and to protest.
We've seen some of the largest protest gatherings in recent times as we come up to these local elections in September. 22,000 people, I think, on the streets last weekend. What does that tell you about the political mood there in Russia? And how representative are those 22,000 people of the rest of the Russian population? 144 million people. Does 22,000 people sort of mean anything? How much do they represent the concerns of the rest of the country?
Well, to be honest, it's been a history of the Russian protest that actually we had very few people protesting on Moscow streets in comparison with the rest of the country. On the height of the Moscow protests in 2011-2012, we had maybe 100,000 people on the streets. And given that we have more than 15 million living in Moscow alone, of course, it's a very tiny fraction. The problem for the Kremlin is that even this number of people going to streets consider it to be a really big challenge. And to be honest, it's very difficult to understand why. Sometimes the Kremlin loves to blame the West, saying that you can find some ominous presence of some hostile forces from abroad behind every Moscow or Russian protest. But I think the problem is that some of the Russian history was not really reflected by the Kremlin. For instance, nobody knows and nobody gave any explanation why actually the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and these actually problems. So you think, well, if a very small number of people could, well, destroy one of the most powerful political regimes in the world just in 3 days, what actually happened in 1991, what might trigger the next big change of political regime? And that makes the Kremlin very nervous, because we actually do not know what might prompt the political change.
One of the things that we do know makes the Russian administration nervous is the internet. We've heard a lot about the role, the alleged role of Russian operatives in foreign elections. How is the internet being used there, and to manage the way people communicate and the way they gather?
But it's quite an interesting thing for Russia, because on the one hand, we have Russian trolls being extremely active and sometimes effective abroad in Europe and in the United States. And at the same time, we see that in Russia, inside the country, the Kremlin sometimes really helpless in dealing with political protests on the internet. For instance, we have the system of internet censorship, but it's, to be honest, it's very primitive, and it's you cannot compare with the China example, for instance. And if you want to get access to sensitive information, for instance, about the Russian military presence in Ukraine, you can easily find this information, and you can watch videos produced by Navalny and so on and so forth. The problem is that one thing is to disseminate something online, and protesters could do that, the Kremlin could do that. But to control the information online, it's a completely new level. It's a completely different level of technology. And right now, the Kremlin doesn't have this technology. They've been trying for many years, almost for 7 years, to develop this kind of technology, but so far they are not really successful.
It's interesting that you talk about sophistication of that ability to censor in Russia, considering how sophisticated the Russian operation has been elsewhere. Do you see the internet continuing to be used in that way, in a more effective way to manage these gatherings, given how fearful the government clearly is and the authorities there are about the way people are protesting now?
Yes, because actually we have technology developing every day, and we have new things. And the problem for the Kremlin is that people in the Kremlin, including the security services, they sort of understand how to deal with hierarchy. So when we see a conventional political party or trade union or movement, offline movement, they sort of understand how to deal with them. But social media, all kinds of social media, they present a formidable challenge, because there are no leaders in many cases. There are no offline organizations. So just imagine that you sit in some office on Lubyanka trying to figure out what might trigger the next protest. You need to know these people, and there are no leaders in many cases. For instance, most of the people who actually were deprived of their right to be elected this year. On Saturday, they were already in jail. Nevertheless, we got lots of people protesting. So you do not need this organizational element to get people to the streets. And obviously, it's a very frightening thing for the Kremlin.
Dmitry Gudkov is among those 30 opposition candidates who were barred from standing in the local elections by the authorities there on the basis that they just didn't have enough support from the broader public. And he says that the country's future is at stake. If we lose the elections now, these elections in general will cease to exist as a political instrument. Is that the view that you share?
Well, I would not be that dramatic, to be honest, because we've been deprived of the right to have the real elections for many, many years. And the last protests in Moscow, 2011, 2012, they happened exactly because of that, because the elections were actually stolen from people. And but what is really interesting here is that the Kremlin is changing strategy. So now the idea is not to, say, help the candidates. The idea is to create a formidable wall and not to let any candidates who might be seen even slightly in opposition to the Kremlin to take part in the election. And of course, it's a new development. It's much more straightforward and very brutal. So in this way, yes, he might be right.
Andrei Soldatov, it's terrific to have you on the program. Looking forward to seeing you here in Australia. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
More than 4 million